Okay, so we're going to be talking about the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. If you already printed this PowerPoint previous to today, uh, you are going to want to look at it again. I cut about 4 or 5 slides out. So just point of reference for you guys, I know this lecture is a little late in getting posted. I mean, it's late for my normal timelines. I did the lecture, I recorded it, and then I've been thinking about some of the slides in the math and what I want this unit to look like, because I'm doing a lot of this from scratch and really just trying to design it in a way that it doesn't matter. I cut out 5 slides, so if you printed this before today, just maybe reprint it or relook at it because I cut out some content. So the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve, the oxyhemoglobin, that term just comes from the fact that the hemoglobin is filled with oxygen. Hemoglobin is a bus that carries lots of different gases. When it's filled with oxygen, it becomes an oxyhemoglobin. When it's filled with carbon dioxide, it's a carboxyhemoglobin. So just know that that's where that comes from. So this is the oxyhemoglobin dissociation curve. If you guys notice on the x-axis, it's got the pressure of oxygen. On the y-axis, you have the percent hemoglobin saturation. I just want to point out, whenever you see these, just PO2 with no A or capital A or V, that's just a general pressure of oxygen. If you add that extra little subscript in there, that's what kind of identifies it as a very specific pressure of oxygen. Same with the saturation of oxygen. If you add a small a here, it becomes the saturation of arterial oxygen for the hemoglobin. So just know that that's kind of the difference there. These are just general pressures. That's why it doesn't have anything denoting whether it's venous or arterial or anything like that. I want to draw your attention to the fact that this is called a sigmoid curve. And the reason they call it that is it's not a linear relationship the whole way up. You get to this certain point here at about 60 where it plateaus off. And that's because when it gets up to about a pressure of 60, it has a lot of oxygen available. And with the hemoglobin, the more oxygen it has, the more oxygen it wants because of positive cooperativity. So when you get up to about this level, it's got a lot of oxygen available, so it kind of plateaus off. Like a lot of its seats are full and it's doing well. So upper part of curve around 60, it's going to plateau off. This is the normal range for arterial blood gases, is between around, it's technically 80 to 100 is normal, but between 60 and 100 is considered in the normal-ish range. When you go down to just 60, it would be considered like a mild hypoxia. So this is kind of the range that you typically see in blood gases. Kind of the thing that you notice is when you get to this level, changes in PO2 start to have kind of a minimal effect on the curve. Whereas if you come to this side of the curve, if you look from 40 to, let's say, 30, that's a huge difference in saturation. It really drops. And that's because in the same way that the more oxygen it has, the more oxygen it wants, when less oxygen is available and less oxygen is bound to the hemoglobin, it makes it harder for that oxygen to bind because it tightens the configuration of that hemoglobin and it makes it harder for oxygen to bind. So up here, it has more affinity for oxygen. It likes oxygen. It wants to bind oxygen. Down here, it's going to have less affinity for oxygen, less likely to bind oxygen. So that's kind of something that's important when we start talking about the loading and unloading of oxygen. The other thing I want to point out here is you have this P50 number, and that's a very specific mark where at 27 millimeters of mercury for your O2 pressure, you should have about a 50% saturation. So 50% of the seats on your buses should be filled with oxygen. This is something that was measured. This is on the normal curve. And then what you can use this P50 number for is to reference whether the curve is shifted right or shifted left. And we're going to talk about what that means. So this is the normal curve in the middle. And then when you shift your curve to the right, so you see how it kind of moved over here to the right, and you have this new line right here. that means that you have a decreased affinity for oxygen. If you shift your curve to the left, you have an increased affinity for oxygen. And we're going to talk about what that means and why we care in just a second. But you can see this P50 number, right? So here at just 20 for your pressure of oxygen, you're at 50% saturation. At the normal level, it's 27. And when you have that decreased affinity for oxygen, it ends up being over here at what I would say is like 33. Okay? So all that's saying is it takes less pressure of oxygen to be at 50% if you increase your affinity. Because basically, if you're increasing your affinity, you're making your hemoglobin like oxygen better, bind easier to oxygen. So it takes a lower pressure of oxygen to get you to 50%. Over on this right side of normal, you're saying that the hemoglobin don't like oxygen, they don't want to bind it, and so it's taking a higher pressure of oxygen to get that same 50% saturation. So that's where that P50 number comes in, is it's kind of like the marker for whether or not your hemoglobin normal like oxygen, really like oxygen, or don't like oxygen. Okay? The factors that we're going to look at that increase your affinity for oxygen are an alkalosis, which we'll talk about more what that means, decreased pressure of CO2 or low H plus ions, a decreased temperature, and a low 2,3-DPG. The 2,3-DPG is this diphosphate glycolate. I totally shanked that, but it's a substance that makes oxygen bind very well when it's low and not bind when it's high. That's all you have to know about that. This is more biochemistry than what you need, so you just have to memorize low 2,3-DPG. Now the alkalosis, the decreased CO2, the low H plus ions, and the decreased temperature, that conceptually you guys are going to understand more about. This you can just memorize. Over here, for the decreased affinity, or where hemoglobin don't like oxygen, that's going to be when it's acidotic or when you have an acidosis, increased PCO2 or high H plus ions, increased temperature, and high 2,3-DPG. So I'm going to go through very quickly an explanation of what these are so you guys understand why we care about a left or a right shift on the curve. So hold on one second. I'm going to open up something else here. Okay, so going back to the diagram from today, I just want to point out something here. So you have your lungs, and this is where your oxygen is going to be very, very high. Okay, you have this PaO2 of about 100. This is an oxygen-rich environment. Also, because your lungs are constantly getting a cycle of new air coming in, your oxygen tend to be a cooler temperature compared to the rest of your body. This is probably marginal, but when you're talking about temperature on that graph, the decrease in temperature from your lungs to, let's say, the tissue in your stomach, right? The tissue in your stomach is going to be warmer than the tissue in your lungs, because when you think about your lungs being a lot of open space for air to fill it, although it's still probably somewhere around body temperature, it's going to be cooler than, let's say, your stomach or your spleen. And that becomes relevant when we're talking about the loading and unloading of oxygen. So in your lungs, you've got lots of oxygen. It's usually a slightly cooler temperature. And you have lower levels of CO2. So that is going to create that pressure difference that we've been talking about, where you can unload the CO2. Sorry, my mic glitched. Okay, so you've got your lungs, oxygen-rich environment. The more oxygen they have, the more oxygen they want for the hemoglobin. So the hemoglobin that are in your lungs are going to have that left shift on the curve. They're going to have an increased affinity for oxygen. The temperature is cooler, right? That's part of it. There's a low CO2, so then you're going to be in a more alkalotic environment. You don't have to worry about the 2,3-DPG, but that's low. that is going to give hemoglobin a high affinity for oxygen. And you want hemoglobin to have a high affinity for oxygen in the lungs because that's where you want it to bind oxygen. That's where you want it to load up as much as it can so it can take it out to the body. Now, when you come out of the lung and you travel out through your heart and then you travel out to your body and you get to your tissues are going to be higher in temperature. They're going to be higher in CO2, higher in H plus ions, more acidotic, and that is going to make that hemoglobin have less affinity for oxygen. This is going to be that right shift in the curve. And when a hemoglobin has less affinity for oxygen, it's going to want to unload it. So it unloads that oxygen into your tissues and instead picks up CO2 and takes it out. So you have high affinity for oxygen in the lungs. It's that left shift in the curve. And then you have low affinity for oxygen in your tissues. It's that right shift in the curve. And that happens because you want to load oxygen up here and unload oxygen down here. And that's how that is working as far as the cycle of transport goes. So kind of coming back to the PowerPoint, and I feel like this is a hard one to do as a recorded lecture. I'm going to come up with a better way with a diagram to explain this because I feel like it's a little difficult with a PowerPoint. But essentially speaking, the right shift in the curve is going to be at your tissues. The left shift in your curve is going to be at the lungs. And if you think about how the environment in your lungs would create this and how the environment in your tissues would create this, it makes sense. When you think about the fact that you want hemoglobin to pick up oxygen in your lungs and drop off oxygen in your tissues, it makes sense as to why this would cause increase in affinity versus decrease in affinity. I have it broken down here where you can see the left shift is caused by decrease H plus PaCO2, a decrease in temperature and a decrease in 2,3-DPG, and a right shift is caused by an increase in H plus ions, PaCO2, an increase in temp, and an increase in 2,3-DPG. Again, if you're looking at different variables, your affinity for oxygen is going to increase when you go to the left, decrease when you go to the right. You're going to load oxygen when you shift to the left because this is where you have that greater affinity for oxygen, so it's going to load oxygen. You're going to unload oxygen when you shift to the right. So you can think of the left as the lung, the right is the tissues. Hemoglobin saturation for a given PaO2 is going to be higher when it's left shifted, and it's going to be lower when it's right shifted. And your P50 number is going to be lower when it's left shifted and higher when it's right shifted. So to show you what I'm talking about, again, that P50 number is just when you reach 50% saturation of your hemoglobin. So if you have a left shift, it doesn't take as much oxygen to get to 50% because you have all of these things making hemoglobin really like oxygen. There's an alkalosis. There's not very much CO2 or H plus ions. The temperature is a little bit lower. You have that lower 2,3-DPG. And what that means is that hemoglobin is more likely to want to nab up oxygen. It wants to load that oxygen on. Over here on the right side, you have all of these things going on, and you're going to have this higher pressure of oxygen to get to 50% saturation. And it's because you have an acidosis, you have this increased PCO2 or high amounts of H plus ions, increased temperature, and high 2,3-DPG. So for right now, because we're going to kind of build on this pyramid style, just really memorize what causes the left shift and the right shift and know that the left is in the lung and it's where oxygen is loaded. The right shift is in the tissues and it's where oxygen is unloaded. And I realize that from a recording standpoint, this was probably not like the greatest. I don't really feel like I won this one. But it's partly because this ends up getting explained more in the next lecture and then more with blood gases and so on and so forth. This one kind of builds a little slower. So for right now, keep it simple. Memorize, because you will have to have them memorized. Memorize this graph, okay? Memorize the saturation being on the y-axis. Memorize the pressure of oxygen being on the x-axis. Memorize that the right shift is the decreased affinity and the things that cause it listed here. The left shift is the increased affinity, and the things that cause it are here. Memorize the left shift or the loading of oxygen is in the lungs, and that the right shift or the unloading of oxygen is in the tissues. We will keep building on this and help it make more sense. This used to be, I think, 11 slides. We're down to 7. So if you've printed this, just relook at it. I cut some things out. So when you're looking at the lecture questions, you have what causes the left shift, what causes the right shift. You should be able to write those down. And then which way would it shift for an increased affinity and which way would it want to unload. So definitely throw them on a flashcard, memorize them up, and then we're going to keep talking about that and building on that as we go. But for right now, definitely know this diagram for the exam and the components of it. That is all I got. I am normally not so lackluster. I'm sorry about that, guys. If you have any questions, as always, email me. Otherwise, you're going to see a lot of content kind of coming up over this weekend.